Things are serious in Togo. The blood of innocents is being shed while the seat of power remains unmoved. Currently, tensions have reached a critical point. Calls for a radical change in governance are multiplying. The Togolese people, especially the youth, are demanding a democratic transition and an end to authoritarianism. The population's protests, mainly concentrated in the capital Lome, have become increasingly violent as security forces harshly suppress gatherings. Clashes between the population and the armed forces are now frequent, with growing violence. The protesters, mainly young people, are expressing their anger at the inaction and abuses of power. Scenes of repression are marked by police and military, violently beating and arresting demonstrators. Currently, the clashes continue, and the situation is becoming increasingly chaotic. At least 7 people have lost their lives during these confrontations between the population and the armed forces. There are also many injuries and arrests. The violence intensifies every day as the government persists in its determination to maintain order at all costs, even if it means sacrificing human lives. The families of the victims, as well as human rights organizations, denounced the excessive repression and abuses by law enforcement. The international community, notably the African Union and human rights organizations, is closely monitoring the situation in Togo. Neighboring countries such as Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Senegal have expressed concern over the escalating violence and are calling for peaceful dialogue. But for now, repression continues to dominate the political scene in Togo. This escalation of violence, marked by deaths and injuries, highlights the urgency of the situation in Togo. The Togolese people, increasingly determined, seem ready to continue their fight for freedom and dignity despite the violence they are enduring. However, the outcome of this conflict remains uncertain, and it is in this tense context that Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, positions himself in support of the Togolese people, calling for a peaceful but urgent transition of power. Ibrahim Traoré, while assuming his role as president of Burkina Faso, realized from the beginning of the crisis in Togo that this situation should not be considered merely an internal issue of one country. The tensions shaking Togo reflect broader difficulties faced by many African countries under authoritarian regimes. Traoré quickly expressed his support for the Togolese youth, this generation that aspires to change but faces a governance system that is often rigid and repressive. In the early weeks of the crisis, Traoré did not immediately take a public stance, preferring first to discreetly contact leaders of Togolese civil society in private conversations. He expressed his solidarity with the emerging democratic movements in Togo, particularly those led by young people. He emphasized the need to support this youth who are fighting for a better future, far from the clutches of authoritarian power. Traoré's messages were clear. Africa can no longer afford to live under regimes that ignore the deep aspirations of their people. The Togolese people, like those of many other countries, have the right to freedom, dignity, and the opportunity to thrive. He also directed criticism at the continent's authoritarian regimes, especially those like Faure Gnassingbé, who have remained in power for decades, blocking all avenues of change and suffocating opposition voices. For Traoré, these regimes are a barrier to Africa's development, and their longevity only keeps people in misery and dependency. Ibrahim understood that Togolese youth in particular play a crucial role in the process of change. He openly committed to supporting their demands not through direct intervention, but by establishing a regional solidarity platform for democratic movements. As the leader of Burkina Faso, he took the initiative to organize dialogues between young leaders of West Africa in order to strengthen the country solidarity networks and coordinate support actions for democracy in Togo. After several weeks of growing tension, Ibrahim Traoré decided to take a strong public stance in support of the Togolese people. He officially declared his support for the peaceful struggle for a change in power and the establishment of a democratic transition. Traoré announced that the Togolese people have the right to free themselves from oppression and that they are not alone in this struggle. In a remarkable speech delivered during a press conference in Ouagadougou, Traoré said, "Togo is one example among many of what Africa is living through today. A people taken hostage by an authoritarian power that crushes its aspirations. The Togolese youth has a right to the future. They have the right to dignity and freedom. We, the African peoples, must unite to support this fight. I stand beside the Togolese people not as a leader imposing solutions, but as a friend and ally in their fight for justice." In this statement, Traoré emphasized that Togo, under the leadership of Faure Gnassingbé, had sunk into a stagnant political system, where the absence of reform and authoritarian control had blocked all forms of social and economic progress. For him, Africa must no longer accept to be ruled by leaders who prioritize maintaining their personal power over the well-being of their people. It is time that Togo, like all countries on the continent, moves toward a true democracy where every citizen's voice counts. He did not stop at criticizing the Togolese regime but called for Pan-African unity. He insisted that the struggle for democracy in Togo is part of a continental dynamic and that the people of Africa must support each other in their pursuit of freedom. Ibrahim Traoré also highlighted the importance of regional solidarity, urging neighboring nations to support the Togolese people in their fight for peaceful and democratic change. What is happening in Togo is a challenge for all of West Africa. It is our duty, as neighbors and African partners, to support the legitimate aspirations of the Togolese people. Togo is not just Togo. It is a symbol of what we want for our country, where freedom and justice are founding principles. Traoré's support goes beyond mere words. He also announced his intention to take concrete diplomatic actions by coordinating an intervention through the Alliance of Sahel States to support a peaceful transition in Togo. Faure Gnassingbé refuses to enter into serious negotiations. Ibrahim Traoré does not settle for offering moral support to the Togolese people. He takes a firm and final stance by issuing an ultimatum to Faure Gnassingbé: you have 72 hours to enable a peaceful transition, or we will organize, with our allies, a transitional mission led by a council of Togolese elders. This unambiguous message marks a turning point in the political process, where regional pressure becomes unavoidable. Traoré's support is more than a symbolic gesture. It becomes real political and diplomatic pressure that translates into concrete actions, mobilizing the international community, coordinating with neighboring countries, and preparing for intervention if necessary. Traoré leaves little room for negotiation if Faure Gnassingbé refuses to step down. Through his clear stance and explicit support for the Togolese people, Ibrahim Traoré becomes a central figure in the fight for democracy in West Africa. He does not only defend Togolese youth, but calls for a profound change in governance across the continent, a change where African leaders must be accountable to their people. Through his solidarity, leadership, and commitment to peaceful transition, he embodies the hope for a new Africa free of authoritarian regimes and ready to embrace a democratic future. The reaction of the Togolese government, led by Faure Gnassingbé, to the public declarations of Ibrahim Traoré and the growing pressure from the Togolese people was immediate but predictable. From the outset, the Togolese authorities labeled Traoré's support for the Togolese people and his calls for a peaceful transition as foreign manipulation and interference in Togo's internal affairs. The government denounced what it described as an attempt at destabilization, particularly emphasizing that the situation in Togo was a domestic matter to be resolved without the interference of external actors. State-controlled media, under direct government supervision, portrayed Ibrahim Traoré as an expansionist leader seeking to impose his will on Togo for geopolitical reasons. Traoré was accused of orchestrating a regional destabilization strategy to weaken existing regimes, and the Togolese government asserted that these actions were nothing more than a disinformation campaign. In response to this external pressure, the security forces intensified the repression of demonstrations in Lome and other cities across the country. Thousands of young people gathered to show their support for Ibrahim Traoré and to demand free elections. Police repression was violent, with the use of tear gas, rubber bullets, and even live ammunition to disperse the crowds. This repression led to many injuries and, as previously mentioned, the death of 7 people in the streets. Instead of responding to calls for dialogue, the Togolese government chose to isolate the country by limiting internet access and imposing curfews in sensitive areas. The authorities also carried out mass arrests targeting opposition leaders and human rights activists who supported the peaceful resistance. These actions not only heightened internal tensions but also drew increasing international criticism, particularly from human rights organizations and the United Nations. Despite the violence of the repression, the determination of the Togolese people remained strong. Protesters continued to take to the streets, chanting slogans of freedom and demanding the end of Faure Gnassingbé's regime. It is in this context of heightened repression that Ibrahim Traoré's appeal gained even more importance, and international solidarity intensified. Facing the increasingly tense situation in Togo, Faure Gnassingbé chose a strategy of apparent silence contrary to what many had expected, which was an immediate and forceful response to the accusations of interference made by Ibrahim Traoré and the international community. Faure Gnassingbé remained relatively quiet in his public statements at the beginning of the crisis. This silence did not mean inaction, but rather a calculated response. Aware of the international consequences of a violent reaction, Gnassingbé likely judged that a hasty response could damage his standing on the diplomatic stage. At a time when international pressure, especially from neighboring countries like Ghana and Senegal, was growing stronger, he chose to wait rather than respond with force. The silence of Faure Gnassingbé also created a space of uncertainty that plunged Togo into a state of paralysis. While protesters demanded immediate change, the government remained silent, fueling the idea of a regime losing control. This political void became fertile ground for the rise of the opposition and civil movements, as well as for the growing legitimacy of Ibrahim Traoré's actions. A climate of uncertainty took hold among the Togolese people. The silence of Faure Gnassingbé also contributed to growing uncertainty among the population. On one hand, Togolese citizens knew that power remained in place, but the lack of clear communication from the president left increasing doubt. Would he give in to the pressure, or resist until the end? This uncertainty about the regime's immediate future further energized street demonstrations. As people sought answers and a democratic future, internationally, this strategic silence had mixed effects. On one hand, It allowed Faure Gnassingbé to maintain a facade of control by avoiding rushed decisions. But on the other hand, it provided a golden opportunity for Ibrahim Traoré to strengthen his role as a moral and political mediator by choosing not to respond immediately. Faure Gnassingbé opened the door to rising tensions as each hour of silence increased popular and international pressure for change. As for Gnassingbé's silence persisted, external pressure mounted. The international community, initially cautious, began to intensify its calls for a peaceful transition. The African Union, Ghana, and Senegal issued repeated statements demanding negotiations between the Togolese government and the opposition. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré continued calling for Pan-African solidarity, reinforcing the legitimacy of both his position and that of the Togolese people. The Togolese government, under the leadership of Faure Gnassingbé, had opted for an initial strategy of repression and strategic silence, believing it would weaken the resistance. However, this tactic only worsened the situation, creating a political vacuum and a climate of uncertainty that strengthened the opposition and the legitimacy of the call for change. The role of Ibrahim Traoré was to bring a vision of solidarity and transition. His message of solidarity and support quickly resonated deeply among the Togolese population, both within the country and throughout the diaspora. His call for peaceful change not only strengthened the resolve of those already fighting for freedom, but also galvanized many citizens who had been hesitant to fully commit to the protest movement. Support from youth and civil society. Togolese youth who formed the backbone of the uprising saw in Ibrahim Traoré a true champion of their cause. His messages resonated as a powerful moral boost in their daily struggle against a system they viewed as oppressive and disconnected from their needs. All across Lome and in other major cities, the streets began to fill with protesters chanting slogans like "Freedom for Togo," "Gnassingbé out," and "The people want change." This support materialized through increasingly massive demonstrations, particularly in working-class neighborhoods, where young people gathered to demand political reform and an end to authoritarian rule. Slogans for freedom, combined with songs and dances, marked these protest moments in which Togolese citizens expressed their desire for a more equitable future. The Togolese diaspora and growing international solidarity. The Togolese diaspora played a central role in spreading Traoré's message and organizing demonstrations abroad. Togolese living overseas, especially in Europe and North America, activated their social networks and organized rallies in front of Togo's embassies to show their support for the struggle for democracy. Sit-ins were held in Paris, London, New York, and other major cities, drawing international attention and showcasing the scale of mobilization. Social media was a vital tool for mobilization, especially in regions where protests were stifled by government censorship. Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram helped broadcast Traoré's messages, relaying images of the protests in Lome and other cities, and allowing the voices of the Togolese people to be heard globally. Well-informed and well-organized, the diaspora also launched fundraising campaigns to support the families of protesters who had been killed or imprisoned. They spearheaded awareness campaigns around human rights violations in Togo. By activating international solidarity networks, the Togolese diaspora played a key role in amplifying the pressure on the government. Protests intensify as the movement gains traction. Protests inside Togo escalated as the movement grew in popularity, evolving from sporadic gatherings into full-blown mass demonstrations. The streets of Lome, once quiet and marked by resignation, became a battleground for Togolese citizens who, for the first time in many years, felt united around a common goal: a free and democratic Togo. Songs of freedom, chants against injustice, and images of violent repression defined these moments of protest. Demonstrators showed unwavering determination in the face of military threats and police violence. This was a fight not only for political change but also for the recognition of the Togolese people's fundamental rights: freedom of speech, access to quality education, and fair distribution of national resources. The demonstrations were not merely a reaction to an immediate crisis but a manifestation of a deeper longing to reimagine Togo, breaking free from cycles of repression and stagnation to build a democratic and prosperous future. Global impact. A symbol of Africa's fight at the international level, the resonance of the Togolese movement was profound. It became more than a fight for Togo, it became a fight for all of Africa. The protests turned into a symbol of African resistance against authoritarian regimes and impunity. Across the continent, people saw in the Togolese uprising an opportunity to reflect on their own political realities. Ibrahim Traoré's role strengthened this symbolic dimension. He made Togo an example of how people can resist oppression peacefully, and his solidarity with the Togolese people inspired many other struggles across Africa. The solidarity of African nations, through demonstrations of support and public statements, reinforced the legitimacy of the Togolese movement, showing that the fight transcended national borders. The protests in Togo and the diaspora took on an iconic dimension. They became a call for Pan-African solidarity and a symbol of the fight for a better future. The active participation of youth and civilians in the movement demonstrated that African youth are ready to stand up for their rights, challenge authoritarian systems, and build a freer, more just continent. The protests did not remain confined to the streets of Togo and the diaspora. They sparked widespread regional support, with neighboring countries expressing their solidarity. This support, coupled with growing international attention, placed an even heavier burden on Faure Gnassingbé, already under significant domestic pressure. The fact that West African leaders publicly took a stand in support of the Togolese people further intensified the pressure on the government, making the ongoing repression increasingly difficult to justify. The protests quickly became a focal point in the broader fight for democracy in West Africa, inspiring similar movements across the region and amplifying calls for a new Africa, one free from authoritarian regimes. What began as an isolated call for solidarity evolved into a powerful Pan-African movement with far-reaching consequences beyond Togo's borders. Backed by the diaspora and figures like Ibrahim Traoré, the Togolese people found their voice and began to reshape their national destiny. The struggle for a free Togo has become a symbol of Africa's broader fight for justice and change. The scale of the protests reflects the deep yearning for transformation that drives many African populations as they confront long-standing authoritarian rule. The situation in Togo raises critical questions. Will this fight for a free Togo succeed? The people have risen to demand regime change, emboldened by leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, and have faced repression with unwavering determination. But in the face of a president who has held power for over 15 years, will he easily relinquish control? The movement continues to grow, but is that enough to shake a regime so deeply entrenched in the country's political fabric? What do you think about this situation? Is Togo on the path toward genuine democracy, or is the country heading toward even harsher repression? The outcome of this struggle remains uncertain, but the voice of the people can no longer be ignored. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below and share your perspective on Togo's future.